started in a few minutes, or maybe even shorter than a few minutes. So if you could start taking your seats, thanks.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of our SAG meeting. Again, I want to, as I expressed last night, I want to thank everybody for contributions yesterday to what we all felt was a very lively day, a lot of great input, a lot of energy around the discussions, and we had a lot of value out of it. Our teams of discussion leaders and note takers met after the meetings and into the evening last night, and have come back with good summaries from each group. So again, the plan is going to be that starting with the audit reporting model, those in room A, the reporter from group A will give a summary of what she heard in group A, and then certainly anybody in that group who feels that they want to emphasize a point or thought that maybe a major point that was made wasn't covered, we really encourage you to bring out that issue at that point in time. So we'll just go group by group and get the report and some feedback from people in that room as to the matters that you thought were really important to the extent they need to be emphasized more or aren't reflected in what you hear. So then we'll do that first of all for about an hour and 15 minutes with respect to the audit reporting model session. Take a break, and then a similar discussion with respect to the outreach with respect to fraud, with similar feedback and interaction with the group. And then after we hear from all groups in both sessions, we encourage group discussion to try to figure out direction and is there a overall message to the PCAOB from our members of the SAG. Before we get started with the audit reporting model, it's been reported recently, but it was in the news today that I just want to make sure everybody is aware of it, that one of our SAG members was just appointed the incoming chair of the NASBA at NASBA, and that's Galen Hansen. So Galen, congratulations. And today with us, who was not here yesterday, is Professor Jim Cox. Professor Cox told me that yesterday he couldn't make it as he was attending a conference regarding fraud, I think. Nodding his head, yes. He learned a lot. So therefore, you'll have a unique aspect to contribute, even though you weren't part of yesterday's discussions. I think you said primarily you learned not to commit fraud. Is that right? All right, so we're going to start with a report from the audit reporting model, and the first group was room A, group A, and one of the discussion leaders there was Lillian Sanoa. So Lillian, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to report that my group was very lively. We applied the street rules, as Marty had suggested yesterday, and I'm happy to report that there were no serious injuries after all the debates that we had. There were no fist fights, so everything turned out okay. So there was a considerable amount of discussion about the merits of the emphasis paragraph or expanded auditor discussion in the report, and whether AS 16 should really be a starting point. One issue that was mentioned was that starting with the auditor communications may cause a chilling effect between the auditor and the audit committee, and that was sort of cited as something to consider as an issue. With regard to whether financial statement matters or auditing matters should be emphasized, the group generally favored financial statement matters and did not favor auditing matters, such as specific auditing procedures, because of describing this type of information could be extensive, may result in information overload, and may not appropriately reflect the amount of effort that went into an audit area. And of course, I just want to reiterate what Marty said. If anyone in our group, if I said anything wrong, please, obviously chime in, or if I left anything out, please chime in. Participants generally believe that the emphasis of the audit process was not as important as the robustness of the disclosures in the financial statements. With regard to financial statement matters to emphasize, it was recommended that the PCAOB look to what analysts look at in developing their models and their cash flows. We heard that there was interest in knowing the following in emphasis paragraphs, that is, what has changed, areas subject to sensitivity, areas that are not apparent to users, for example, a disclosure that may be subtle, information that goes beyond what is required by GAAP to provide more valuable information to the user. In terms of what should be communicated, there's certain matters communicated to the audit committee that are required to be included in the auditor's report. We had heard that investors want the following 4 things, which is insights on the quality and not just the acceptability of the accounting policies and practices, significant unusual transactions, high financial statement risk, the appropriateness of critical accounting estimates. There was debate regarding the amount of insights with this regard, the amount of insights that the auditor would provide to the audit committee that would be different information provided to users by management. There were also factual matters, in terms of what is not specifically required in AS 16 should be included in emphasis paragraphs. We heard that there are factual matters that should be emphasized. These include material fraud, violations of law, and instances where there's impaired independence. A counter to that, there are also things that investors do not care about that is included in AS 16 and therefore should not be emphasized. Some examples of these are difficult or contentious matters, disagreements with management, as these would be presumed that these would be resolved. In terms of if things were left to the discretion of the auditor, what are the factors or the criteria that the auditor would use in determining the things that they would highlight? It was suggested that auditors look at what investors demanded through the PCAOB's outreach, what we had heard, that the PCAOB should consider whether we use data points such as audit effort or time spent discussing with the audit committee versus factors such as impact on future cash flows. If the PCAOB would provide specific topics that the auditor should emphasize and allow the auditor to use their judgment, we had heard some people or one person say that this approach may result in firms competing via emphasis paragraphs by conveying the quality of their work. In terms of what is the appropriate level of detail that should be provided in the emphasis paragraphs, we heard that it should include the description, it should include why it's important, and it should include the location. We had a considerable amount of discussion in this area. The disclosures, we heard some believe that they should just point to disclosures in the financial statements, serving as a roadmap for investors' attention to those areas. And as a consequence to that, we also heard that by emphasizing certain of these areas, that these areas would most likely be the best written disclosures. Some did not think a roadmap was necessary. Instead, they preferred to receive specific detail from the auditor, whether it was original or not. We also had heard communicated to us that investors will be disappointed if we only require a roadmap. Others indicated that there would be concern about confusion between what management reports and what the auditor emphasizes. And sort of the question was posed, how are users supposed to reconcile the information when it's different? However, others believed, again, that this would not occur because management would probably not allow that and adjust their disclosures. And to that point, then the question was, okay, so if management adjusts their disclosures and we auditors have the emphasis paragraph, then there would be a repeat of information. The information would be shown twice. We also heard, are you driving GAAP through auditing? Believes that the auditor should only attest to the information. Another challenge noted was that free writing would take negotiating the language in the emphasis paragraphs, would cause negotiation of language in emphasis paragraphs, and that would add some more time causing constraints with trying to meet your reporting deadlines, your already tight reporting deadlines. When asked whether there should be specific reasons to cite in the emphasis paragraphs as to why the auditor chose to emphasize a certain matter, we heard that the reasons should be self-evident because they would probably be related to matters that are volatile, material, subjective, and have an effect on the future. With regard to the question on whether there should be special reporting considerations for auditors of smaller and less complex companies, brokers and dealers, and emerging growth companies, we heard the following. We heard consider making it scalable, possibly consider a phase-in period starting with large accelerated filers. Investment companies should be excluded because they are simple and their infrastructures are outsourced. Exclude wholly owned subsidiaries, which broker-dealers may fall into that. And in deciding what types of audits to exclude, look to who the users of the financial statements are and the complexity of the organization. And then a question was raised, what if you have a company that is not complex or doesn't really have anything significant to report? What should the auditor say in that situation? With regard to the last question, are there specific elements of the project of other regulators or standard setters that the PCAOB should consider for its auditor's reporting model project? There were no specific elements noted. However, it was recommended that the PCAOB continue to monitor these activities of other regulators and standard setters. There were also some other points that were made, and I'll go over those as well, that were not specifically on point with the questions. We heard some want the auditor to indicate that the financial statements are presented fairly and not just that they are presented fairly in accordance with the accounting framework. We heard that this project should not be viewed in a vacuum. When auditor partner identification becomes effective, along with the required and expanded use emphasis paragraphs, the market or investors will start tracking disclosure of emphasis paragraphs by partner to glean any trends associated with that partner. We heard auditor liability concerns relative to emphasis paragraphs, and then we heard some points regarding cost benefit, that the PCAOB should continue to issue standards that are in the best interest of investors and should not be fearful of cost benefit analysis, that auditors should do a better job articulating costs of what investors want in auditors' reports, including impact on audit quality. And then lastly, we heard a recommendation or suggestion that we do a 5-year sunset provision for implementation of this with a retrospective cost-benefit analysis. Hopefully I got that right.
I especially like the part about don't worry about a cost-benefit analysis. Was that authoritative?
I think Mike Gallagher has his card up.
So group, again, so thank you very much, Lillian. That group was led by Keith, and Jeanette was in there as well, and Lillian. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Marty. Good summary, Lillian. And Marty, let me start by complimenting you on the format of yesterday. I think it was incredibly conducive to a substantive dialogue, and I would hope that we would take this forward to future discussions and having the breakouts, because I think it really is conducive to a good back and forth where we can grab a lot of substance. I know that we have to balance what we do in the public and versus what we do privately, but I think that was a really good balance. In terms of the subject, I think it was a really good session. I think it was a good dialogue. I think Lillian summarized it well. I do think it's important that the emphasis matters, I think, is the way to go. I think it's important, however, to stick with the principles. We laid out some principles both as a firm and as a CAQ, particularly around the original information about the company and where that should come from, respecting roles, the different roles of management, audit committee, and the auditor, and at the same time making sure that investors and users get the information they need and the role of the auditor is critical in making sure that that information is high quality, and we all know that the auditors play a significant role, even in the financial statement footnotes that occur today, in working side by side with management and making sure they're as transparent and clear as they can be. And I think that this would move it even to a higher level. As you said, Lillian, anything that the auditor would emphasize, those are likely to be the best written footnotes in the document. I think there's definitely value there. I just think the important part of sticking to the principles is to avoid the idea of moving to auditor discussion and analysis just by a different name, one paragraph at a time. And I think that those principles kind of stick to, driving the value that you can get out of emphasis of matter. It's something that's practical, it's doable, and I think it provides significant value to investors. So thanks again. I thought it was a great session yesterday.
Thanks, Mike. Joe Carcello.
Let me start by saying I agree with Mike that it was a great session yesterday. I think it was very productive. We made the part in terms of the second part of what we said. I think if all you end up with, Marty, at the end of the day is the standard as currently written with some wording changes and reference to 2 or 3 or 4 paragraphs in the notes that the auditors emphasize, and that's it, I think the board really runs the risk of having this project viewed as an abject failure in the investor community. I have rarely seen so much commonality in terms of feedback the board has received, both directly and indirectly, in terms of multiple studies, in terms of what investors want. Yesterday when we talked, and Steve Buller from BlackRock was very articulate, but if you go back and you look at the transcript of the roundtable on auditor reporting, Marty, I would say BlackRock, although supportive of changes among the investors who spoke at that meeting, were probably among the more cautious investors. The other investor groups and investor advocates wanted even more information than they seemed willing to accept. So I think it's very important to keep in mind. And the thing that keeps coming through to me in terms of 3 major areas, if at the end of the day investors don't know more about risks, if they don't know more about judgments and estimates, and if they don't know more about unusual transactions, there's going to be a significant percentage of the investor community that's going to say you have failed. I don't know how to be polite but more direct than that.
Jeffrey, your card was up. Did Joe speak for you?
Just to add what Joe just said, in developing the concept release that was issued last year, the PCAOB staff did extensive outreach to the investor community. And their conclusion was, and I'm quoting from the concept release, there was consensus among investors that the auditor has significant insight into the company and that the auditor's report should provide additional information based on that insight to make it more relevant and useful. So if that view is correct, if that is the consensus of investors, and there seems to be some other surveys and studies that suggest that is accurate, I think that raises the question, if you move forward and you're just pointing to other footnotes and you're not providing auditor insights, I think when you get to the cost-benefit analysis that you have to perform, I think there's a question as to what is the benefit if this change that you're making to the auditor's report is not responsive to the consensus from investors, the consensus view. Thank you.
Rick Murray's got his card up. I know, Rick, you weren't in that group, but did you want to
Marty,
comment on something?
I I think we need and deserve your guidance at this point for making the best use of this morning as to whether we're going to, in fact, run through the reporting cycle as you outlined, or take the deep dive into what's the right answer at this point of the discussion.
Well, I think each group member here has had an opportunity in their group to make key points. I think we heard an issue from Mike, and we've heard the other side of the equation from Joe and Jeff in that group. So I think we've got a lot of benefit of hearing a summary from Lillian, but then maybe some emphasis from the others. So I would like to keep with the path of going through the groups and then letting people who are in that group comment on that. We'll have more time after that to kind of delve into your point of which I think is get to a solution, but I think that would be if that's what you said, I think that would be a challenge in this room.
No, I was hoping we weren't going to do that at this point.
Misunderstood your point, Rick.
My concern was that we seemed to be drifting quickly into searching for final summaries of position rather than going through the process you had outlined.
Okay, well, we will try to go through the process I outlined, but as we said, after each team reports as to what they heard in their group, we did want to give people who are in that group an opportunity to say, I think I have a little different color than maybe what you said in your summary. So we'll try to stick with that and see how it works. The second, sorry, Steve, were you in that group?
Yes. Yes, thank you, Marty. So I just wanted to clarify the one point you highlighted. I think that the group felt that the PCAOB should not feel constrained about cost when considering solutions initially, so that they have the chance to come out with what they think is the best solution. But we agreed, I thought, that cost still is an important factor that needs to be considered at some step along the process. We just thought the initial process has to be free-flowing and has to make sure all ideas are on the table. And Lillian, by the way, did a wonderful job summarizing our group and made us sound much better than we were, believe me.
Lillian has a way of doing that, so very good. The next group is going to be summarized by Elena Bashkova, which included Jennifer, and who else? And Steve Harris. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. The discussion in our group was a little bit different from that in Group A. It was a little bit more free-flowing, so I will not necessarily be associating each one of the takeaways from our group to a specific question. But the key takeaways from the discussion in Group B are the following. The majority of participants in Group B suggested staying away from the list of required communications in Auditing Standard 16 and instead focusing on a more narrow list of areas that could be considered for emphasis paragraphs in the auditor's report. Some consensus seemed to emerge around the list of 4 items that would generally be of interest to investors, such as 1, how comparable are the financial statements to those of peer companies in the same industry? Is there any reason for them not to be comparable? 2, how different would the financial statements be if management used other reasonable estimates and judgments? 3, what are some of the unusual transactions and events? And 4, what is the auditor's view about whether there are any unusual risks related to the company? It was recognized that there are a number of challenges with respect to this list, such as potential litigation. A participant suggested a safe harbor for auditors in the case of expanded reporting. Another challenge that was discussed was the historical nature of the audited financial statements, including the auditor's report, versus the more current financial information, such as earnings releases and quarterly reports that are often used in investment decision-making. Another challenge that was mentioned was whether the auditor is motivated to make any of these disclosures. A few SAG members in Group B thought that Auditing Standard 16 may be a source for determining the kinds of considerations and factors that would go into a framework for what should be disclosed in the auditor's report, which should be based on the auditor's judgment and not disclosing the actual communication with the audit committee. It was further discussed that a reasonable investor might want to know those items that were contentious between the auditor and management. Many participants also thought it was very important not to chill the discussion with the audit committee as a result of any additional auditor reporting. Some participants said that an argument can be made for management to provide any information of interest to investors rather than the auditor. Other participants pointed out that there are reasons for auditors to be the source of that information, such as their independence. A key point of discussion was whether any emphasis paragraphs should be focused on audit-related or accounting-related matters. And many of the participants in our group supported a view that management should be providing any accounting-related information, and the auditor should be focused just on audit-related matters. While there was a general support that the auditor could provide audit-related information, there was no consensus on what that information could actually be. But it was mentioned that it could be related to the 4 items described earlier. The group discussed that the current reporting model does not give the auditor a voice. It was acknowledged that at the heart of this project is whether, in order to serve investors better, we should provide the auditor a voice and consider on which topics the auditor should provide information to benefit investors. Auditor association with management discussion and analysis and with non-GAAP measures was deemed valuable by many participants, as this type of information is typically used in investment decision-making. It was also noted that there will be some cost associated with anything of value that the auditor can provide, and there is also a time aspect to the auditor providing more information in the auditor's report. A few participants believe that it would be worthwhile to combine the going concern project with this project due to the reporting of risk and uncertainty elements. And last but not least, a participant thought that certain brokers and dealers should be exempted due to their ownership structure and nature of operations. So with that, any comments from Group B? And I see Rick. No. Steve? No.
Wayne Collins.
Oh, Wayne, I'm sorry.
Yeah, a good summary, Elena. One thing in terms of the audit process and the focus being more on the audit rather than financial reporting was a view taken by some. But in terms of the audit process, I believe it was the results of the audit process, not the results of the audit, not the process itself. In other words, no detailed listing of audit procedures that resulted in an auditor's view.
Thank you.
Bill Platt.
Thanks, Marty. First, I guess I would just compliment you also on the format of the meeting. I think it was very productive. I found both the breakouts I was in yesterday afternoon to be a very good dialogue that took each of the participants evolved their thinking or views as a result of that dialogue, and I found it to be a more productive way to try to really tackle how do we best solve issues. Also, Elena, I don't know how you took the chaos of our group and turned it into that nice organized summary, but congratulations. You made us sound like we were geniuses, but I would say that the point about focusing on, and you mentioned 4 questions or 4 areas, and I would say in our group, we didn't necessarily say that we didn't have a vision as to whether that was accomplishable or not, or how one might best adding value in providing an auditor's voice on each of those items. They are aligned with what investors were asking for. And if you look at page 3 of the summary, I think there's 4 bullets, and they're generally aligned with those 4 bullets. But we thought that rather than exploring hundreds of types of things that, I'll be facetious by that comment, but hundreds of types of things that might be considered, that maybe if we took a deeper dive on 4 and really tried to explore to say what's practicable, what's feasible, and what can add value at the same time, and maybe value is a more important driver than I implied by the ordering of what I had, that would be a productive exercise to go through. So, but I think you did a great job summarizing what the group's discussion was.
Bill, I'm interested in, or anybody else in your group, in the context of the first group. I thought I heard a lot of support for emphasis of matters paragraph, and then Joe made an editorial, emphasized that it needed to go further than just pointing to the footnotes. But the listing that Elena gave of matters that maybe would be discussed, and I don't know, Elena, if you could just summarize those one more time. It didn't sound necessarily like matters in the financial statements to be emphasized. It did sound more of, I'll say, AD&A-like. Can you just say what those 4 or 5 items were that you thought there was some support around?
Sure. The first one is, how comparable are the financial statements to those of peer companies in the same industry, and is there any reason for them not to be comparable? Second one is, how different would the financial statements be if management used other reasonable estimates and judgments? 3, what are some of the unusual transactions and events? And 4, what is the auditor's view about whether there are any unusual risks related to the company?
Marty, I think that certainly some of those would be disclosures in the financial statements and are consistent with emphasizing that. One would think that take estimates as an example, that the significant estimates and the ones that if estimates were different would have significant impact on financial statements should and have robust disclosure and footnotes. And so the auditor's reporting, I think, would be complementary with the disclosure you would see in financial statements. I think significant unusual transactions would be the same aspect. I think when you get to things like risk, and I think our discussion focused on financial statement risk, not risks to the entity, although some had some discussion about risks to the entity, but I think there was a number of people in our group who felt that an auditor is not really the right person to talk about business risks or environmental risks. What we are, where we do have a special area of expertise is on financial statement risk. That might be something that's not in the notes, that the companies aren't necessarily disclosing that. But I think part of looking at this would be to say what information is useful to investors, and then how best to convey that. And I think ultimately it probably is a combination of management reporting supplemented to some degree by auditor statements or auditors' views.
Good. Thanks for that clarification. And the point you made about risks, I think, is a good one too. That word is tossed out a lot, and you clarified that you thought that you were talking about risks of material misstatement in the financial statements. Joe, you said before 3 things have to be included, otherwise we'll miss the boat. You said risks, significant unusual transactions, and significant judgments and estimates. Is your context of risks the same thing? Risks of material misstatement in the financial statement?
Yes.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. Wayne.
I just wanted to add one thing in the context of the unusual items. There was an idea thrown out about the auditor, some kind of auditor association with non-GAAP information, with a non-GAAP earnings number, which might then flesh out unusual items that are reported by management, or unusual items that maybe should be reported by management and called out by them.
Did you say Kevin Riley? Kevin Riley?
Yeah, Marty.
You were in my group, Kevin. You forgot?
I have a question for Elena and maybe other members of the group. But and as Barb gives the debrief on our conversation, one of the thoughtful comments that was raised is we don't want to risk turning auditors into equity analysts. And when I hear the 4 issues that Elena raised as things that auditors might want to focus on, particularly things like what might the financial statements look like if management had used some other assumptions or issues, is that we're drifting away from auditor responsibility more into equity analyst land, and I just wanted to get some additional perspective or color commentary on that particular question.
I agree with your point. That's why I sort of went to that as well. It sounded outside of the financial statements, including how does the accounting compare to a peer group? I think that was one of your points too. So,
well, I think the way this list was developed was really points that would be of interest to investors, and the discussion focused around that. And there were various points of view as to, who may be in the best position to provide some of this information. And I wouldn't characterize, the discussion as a consensus that all of this would come necessarily from the auditor, but there was generally consensus that these types of matters would be of interest to investors. And so it's up to us to consider, how to take that in consideration for purposes of this project.
Mike Cook.
Marty, maybe just to add a little bit of flavor to that as well. Our group was just, wide-ranging, very provocative kind of a discussion. I thought it was very good, and capturing it was an incredible task and well done. But I think this discussion of the 4 items was not recommending that those 4 items are going to find their way into the auditor's report. I think it was in the context, and Greg should speak to this because he was the thought leader behind that particular discussion, was about the kinds of things that investors would be interested in and might, if practical considerations could be or problems could be overcome, might be targets to be moving toward, both by management and the auditor in reporting. And I thought it was a very good discussion. I don't think there was a consensus that we're ready to move to those items being included in the auditor's report, other than, in a transition basis. But I would like to just, and Wayne picked up one of these items, follow a suggestion which, again, didn't necessarily garner great hordes of support, but it was suggested that there are existing disclosures and information outside the basic financial statements that you, by auditing or by associating the auditor with them, MD&A, the risk factors that are disclosed, and non-GAAP information, could be dealing with and giving auditor assurance at some appropriate level to a number of the things that people tell us that they would be interested in. MD&A would take you to critical accounting policies, judgments and estimates. Risk factors would deal obviously with that subject, and non-GAAP information would be particularly valuable, because the message here is that GAAP isn't telling people what they need to know, and here's what you need to know to assess the results of this company, and the auditors are directly associated with what doesn't tell you enough, but are not associated with what you need to know. And that seemed to me, and perhaps others, to be a bit of an anomaly when I think about how important the non-GAAP presentations are to investor communications and audit committees, and the time that is spent on them for the auditors to be detached from that seemed to be missing an opportunity. So that was kind of where we're coming from, and or at least my thought in those 3 items is, instead of the almost impossible task of identifying all the things that people might emphasize in the future, or auditors might be reporting on in the future, that seems like almost a hopeless task. And I certainly, and I think our entire group, almost to a person, said AS16 is not the right framework, and we should not be using AS16 as a source for what auditors might report on. But I think if you can use the existing frameworks that are there, well understood, and all we need to do is wrap some part of the auditor around those disclosures, you could accomplish a high percentage of this without the, again, impossible task of trying to define what should be in and should be out. So I thought that was an important part of our discussion, but I don't think we should overemphasize the 4 items. They were very thoughtful, but I don't think anybody was ready to sign on that we're going to have auditors doing those things in the near future, or maybe ever.
That's a good clarification, so thanks for sharing that. And I had a feeling it was an engine and caboose discussion coming down the path any moment as well. If there are no more cards up, third group, Group C, was Jessica, Greg Skates, and Lou Ferguson from PCAOB.
I want to tell Lillian that I had a better group than she did. Not as a general comparison, just better. We did have some similar points to what Lillian pointed out, not as many similar to Elena's group. So I felt like in our group we had some broad support for emphasis paragraphs that I think everybody kind of thought that emphasis paragraphs was a good way to go for this project. And in discussing what should be included and what we should think about as a framework, we talked about AS16, and there was really limited support for using AS16 as a basis for what to communicate. However, maybe some of the items in AS16 should be used as a consideration. And we got into a little bit further about what types of things that are in AS16 that might be used as a consideration. And of course, it talks about critical accounting estimates and critical accounting policies and practices, as well as significant risks. AS16 also includes a lot of information about the audit. There was limited or no support really for including a lot of information about the audit, such as audit procedures or audit strategy. And partially the reason for that is because it would be very difficult to summarize the audit procedures into a concise paragraph that would be understandable to users of the financial statements. We also talked about whether or not there should be certain matters that the PCAOB prescribed should be in an auditor's report, or if a lot of the matters should be up to the auditor's discretion. And there was really no support in our group for the PCAOB determining what should be in an emphasis paragraph. However, that maybe there are certain matters that we could point out in the standard that the auditor should really consider and think about these certain matters, but maybe not make it a requirement. So we found in our group that there really was more consensus for the auditors to use their discretion in determining what to emphasize using an established framework or some kind of framework, maybe not one that's currently established. And so we talked about what kind of things that the auditor should think about in determining what to emphasize. And so someone in our group suggested that the auditor should think about the greatest risks of material misstatement to the financial statements, and about significant risks that the auditor identified in doing the risk assessment procedures. And then you have other matters such as the estimates, the critical accounting policies and practices, and the critical accounting estimates. We also talked about what kind of detail should be included in the auditor's report. And I think one of the things we talked about was obviously the matter should be identified, but really why the auditor is identifying it, as opposed to just a roadmap that says go look at a certain financial statement disclosure, but why is the auditor identifying it? And one person gave an example in our group that presenting information to investors that might be calculable from the financial statements, but maybe not readily apparent, may aid investors in understanding why such matters are important from an audit perspective. In that instance, it was such as a percentage of level 3 assets or the hard to value assets. And that would at least give information to the investors about why the auditor is highlighting it, but without providing new information, because that information can come from the financial statements. We also heard that that the auditor should not be communicating matters that are not in the financial statements, so that the auditor should be really pointing to things that are in the financial statements, and also maybe summarizing them in a manner that is easier for an investor to understand why the auditor is highlighting it. There was a broad concern in our group, we think, that these emphasis paragraphs could become boilerplate over time, and that the PCAOB needs to consider how to avoid boilerplate disclosures, the same disclosure every year, or the same disclosure for the different companies that have similar matters. It should be specific to the company and specific to the matter. We also talked about whether there should be certain reporting considerations for different types of entities, smaller and less complex, brokers and dealers, and emerging growth companies. And what we got out of that is really we need to think about the standard as being scalable, as opposed to trying to eliminate or exempt certain companies. Maybe we just need to consider that it should be scalable. And then there are some other suggestions that came out of our group, that the board should perform field testing on this standard, and that it should include the auditors, issuers, and investors in our field testing. And then we should also do a post-implementation review after the standard has been implemented. So we could do that through inspections or other ways. And then we did have one suggestion that perhaps we should make changes to the auditor's report gradually over time. We could start with a roadmap and then work towards maybe more disclosure in the emphasis paragraphs over a period of time. And then ultimately, we had a suggestion that emphasis paragraphs or in changes to the auditor's report could increase the quality of the financial statement disclosures if you are pointing to it, and could increase the audit quality. So that was what we heard in Group C. Does anyone in Group C want to comment? Yay. I got no one.
Yeah, good job of summarizing, getting a diverse view. I had 2 points, just wanted to emphasize, really not disagree, but emphasize of your point. One was, and it relates back to what Lillian, you reported as well, is we thought when the auditors do include an emphasis paragraph, it will clearly improve the disclosure in the financial statements. And particularly when we talked about adding the second piece of that disclosure, which why the auditor thought it was important, it would really focus the issuer on making sure those disclosures are appropriate in that. The other point you mentioned about liability, we were a little concerned that as this went forward, you could get over-disclosure on behalf of the audit firms because they were trying to minimize their risk as well. So when we talked about that, we were concerned about, okay, if one firm has 6 risks and someone's talking about 8 risks, the next thing you know, the next firm next year will come out with 8 risks because their attorneys have told them what happens if you don't get the risk disclosed in the emphasis of matters. So we were concerned about driving those disclosures to the point where they don't become helpful, because it's like the current risk disclosures in a 10K, not very helpful. Thank you.
Gary Kabrick.
Hi, by the way, Jessica, very good summary of our meeting yesterday. Just one thing we did discuss, I don't know that we had a consensus on it, but it was discussed in any event, not roundly rejected, was should the audited financial statements and or the auditor's report be amended to include critical accounting policies. That's today's resident in the MD&A, and I think a lot of the items that the investor community is asking for about auditor involvement with sensitivity, alternative accounting policy selections and stuff. That's what the critical accounting policy section is designed to do. Now, there might be degrees of, compliance with it out in the world, but I think what would happen is if the auditors were associated with it, I think the bar would be raised. Perhaps better critical accounting policy disclosures, more consistent with at least the spirit, of which the CAP rules were enacted out 10 years or so ago. Again, there wasn't necessarily a consensus on it, but by sweeping those inside the financial statements and underneath the audit report, I think some of the concerns with it, being addressed here about the criticality of accounting policy and such start to get to be addressed. Again, no consensus, but I think something you put in the work plan, for consideration.
I assume it's recognized that that point, Gary, whether the opinion should be extended to cover critical accounting policies would be really probably outside the scope of, I think outside the scope of what the PCAOB could do. What's in financial statements is based upon rules that are not ours. So therefore, the auditors express an opinion on what's in the financial statement. So somebody else would have to make that determination to put that into the financial statements.
Yeah, no, we understand that. I mean, but it's your organization, the SEC and the FASB work together. It's just part of the overall process.
Jerry De St. Pierre.
Thank you, Marty. I agree also that the summary that you gave, Jessica, was right on the mark. And the one spin, and it was only that I wanted to add, is that the idea that as we were going through this process with the auditor to determine what was in and what was not in, it was going to be sort of a framework. That part of that framework would be something akin to, I'm not saying it would be the same as, but a SAB 99, what's important to the investor, so that the focus here is back on the user and not just on the accounting and what the numbers, because some numbers can move in material ways and not have a material impact on what investors are thinking, and others can move in less ways and have more impact. So the idea here was to try to get a focus on what would be important to the user.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you. Jessica, very good summary. I just wanted to underscore one of the points from the group. We keep hearing comments about potential roadmaps, and I'm not sure all of us have the same idea of what a roadmap might look like. And I just wanted to highlight from a user's perspective that if an emphasis paragraph is included, having some commentary on why it is important. Our group talked about whether we wanted a War and Peace or we wanted a third grade reader in terms of the content of what was being added. And I take that point to heart, but I think from a user's perspective, why the paragraph is being added is important. And I think the intention is to provide more information and more valuable information. And from my perspective, if it becomes an indexing of information that's already provided in the financial statements, that will not be helpful.
Sam Ranzilla.
I just want to pick up on the point Gary made, and we had very limited discussion as a result of a very effective discussion leader on anything other than the 5 questions. But I do think, as I have for 2.5 years now, that the answer here is somewhere embedded in an attestation, excuse me, by the auditor of a critical accounting estimates, critical accounting policies. One very well could argue, why do we need both of those terms? And Marty, I fully recognize that such an approach requires the board to work with other organizations in order to effect such a change. But while I am a supporter of where you're headed, or where I think you're headed in terms of emphasis of matter paragraphs, I continue to believe that that is the second best option, and that an attestation of some limited portion around critical accounting estimates and using existing interpretations that the SEC has would really drive better disclosures, and the Auditors Association with those better disclosures, I think hits the mark closer to what investors are asking for.
Sam, do you think there's sufficient rules around requirements in critical accounting estimates and critical accounting policies that an auditor could attest to that today versus what I'll say is maybe interpretive guidance out of the SEC with respect to those areas?
I do. I mean, I think that if you look at the existing interpretation that the SEC has, especially, I mean, my focus has been primarily around critical accounting estimates. And again, I struggle a bit with why we need 3 different concepts around a company's accounting policies and estimates: significant accounting policies, critical accounting policies, and critical accounting estimates. I mean, we ought to be able to come up with a definition of things that, when you look at it, you say, what are the most important policies and practices of the company with respect to its financial reporting? And as a result, we end up with, I think, complications that are unnecessary. But to your point, I think if others don't, I wouldn't object to additional interpretations, to additional frameworks that would help an auditor benchmark against that. But I think today an auditor could do that.
Thanks, Sam. I'm sorry, Dan Montgomery?
Thanks, Marty. And first of all, I just wanted to express again my appreciation for allowing me to represent the IAASB at this meeting and in the breakout session yesterday. And Jessica, I thought, great job. Definitely a very good summary of the discussion of the group. I did want to come back to one point, and that is, it's been raised by a couple of the other folks on including in the emphasis paragraph at least something to indicate why the auditor believed the matter was of importance to users. And this is something that the IAASB has heard from global stakeholders. And I think in part it speaks to some of the misperceptions about why this information is being asked for in the first place. What we have heard, what the IAASB has heard internationally, is that this is more related to the relevance and the value of the audit, and it's not about the accounting. So while some believe that the auditor is being asked to provide information to fill gaps in terms of understanding the accounting or the complexity of the accounting, the global stakeholders that the IAASB has talked with have said that that is not the case. They recognize that if there are issues with accounting that need to be fixed, that is the role of the accounting standard setters. That what's helpful, though, is to get a little more transparency into the audit. And by having the auditors identify those matters that were of the most importance or considered the most importance in the audit, because they were matters of financial reporting complexity or matters of significant management judgment or matters that had been discussed with those charged with governance, that information is what is important to users to get a better understanding of where the auditors were focusing their effort. And then in turn, by having at least a little bit of information about why that matter was considered important to the audit, that provides at least a little bit of insight into the auditor's risk assessment process and the way the audit was approached.
Thanks, Dana. And I'm glad you sort of clarified, I think, further at the end about the audit, because on the other hand, I do think we're hearing that people are not necessarily interested in some sort of brief summary of audit procedures. And I think you've acknowledged that's not the case here. It's about the audit, but why was this particular matter in the financial statements being emphasized? Because of its importance to the audit. And then why was it important to the audit as opposed to procedures? Thanks. Any cards up? Okay, then the final group, Barbara Vanich is going to report on, and I was in that group with Jim Doty and Jay Harris as well from the PCAOB. Hanson.
Thanks, Marty.
I always mix up Steve Harris and Jay Hanson. I try to combine the two of you constantly.
Thanks, Marty, and good morning. At least I know I can't screw it up worse than that. So it's always great going last once all the best jokes have been used. But honestly, Group D, take comfort in the fact that everyone knows we saved the best for last. Group D had a really constructive discussion. We didn't exactly stick to the discussion questions, no matter how many times I kicked Marty under the table. But I believe at the end of the day, we answered most of them. And so I've tried to summarize the topics we discussed in that order, which I can just hope does justice to the thoughtful commentary that we had from our participants yesterday. We also had some suggestions that were a little beyond the scope of the discussion paper, but which nonetheless were very valuable, and so I'll try to add them on to the end. And in the interest of summarizing, I'm really going to take the first two discussion questions kind of at the same time because that's how we discussed them. So with respect to what matters communicated to the Audit Committee under AS16 should be in an emphasis paragraph and why, and what would not be appropriate why, and whether financial statement and auditing matters should be emphasized or only should financial statement matters be emphasized. I think our group focused on what was important, and that it's important to have important matters included in an emphasis paragraph. And given the existing requirements for auditors to communicate important matters to the Audit Committee, there's likely going to be overlap. However, I didn't hear that we should use AS16 as a checklist or as a kind of check the box on what should be included. Our group was fairly supportive of including emphasis matters paragraphs and focused, I think, more on financial reporting type matters, such as significant accounting estimates and judgments, significant unusual transactions, transactions with related parties that are material, material uncertainties, and other matters that affect the risk of material misstatements to the financial statements. With respect to auditing matters, there wasn't as strong a support. There wasn't a lot of dissent on perhaps some very high-level matters, such as audit strategy or plan. But we didn't, as a group, seem to have a lot of value in communicating audit procedures at that level of detail. Some participants thought that when you talked about what matters are important to an audit, there would generally be overlap with significant accounting matters, and so you might actually get to the same place. With respect to what should not be included, I think our group was generally of the view not to include original material by the auditor, and that while the auditor should have judgment and discretion on what should be emphasized, they should not use judgment in the actual material that's being reported. We spent quite a bit of time kind of starting with a model matter of emphasis paragraph that would include the matter, why the auditor chose to emphasize the matter, and where the matter is further discussed in the financial statements. While our group suggested that we could go ahead and require the emphasis paragraph, they were definitely not as supportive of being prescriptive regarding the content. And we had a range, I thought, that was interesting of kind of at most having a rebuttable presumption that certain matters would be communicated, while others at the other end of the range suggested it should be much more discretion based on the auditor's judgment. With respect to if matters to emphasize were left to the auditor's discretion, what factors should the auditor consider in determining what matters are most important to financial statement users, I think that we generally focused on items that were subject to measurement uncertainty or that were otherwise significant to a user's understanding of the financial statements. It all came down at the end of the day to where auditors spend their time and what keeps the auditors up at night. With respect to what the appropriate level of detail that should be provided in the emphasis paragraph, I think we spent quite a bit of time talking about the merits and the risks associated with various types of discussion that the auditor could have, and that generally, again, auditors would not include new information, but would rather reference where in the financial statement information is included. And while I think we did acknowledge that many investors might find more information valuable, that the risks don't outweigh the rewards, and that you could potentially, if an auditor reported inaccurate information or made the wrong judgment, you could have the auditor, that paragraph changing the valuation of the company, and that would not be a good consequence to have. When we talked about whether there would be any special reporting considerations for audit of smaller and less complex companies, broker-dealers, or emerging growth companies, I think we didn't hear that there would be any kind of carve-outs. And in fact, several people mentioned that they thought it might be particularly important for emerging growth companies who, because of a lack of a large accounting staff or focus, might actually have more risk of material misstatements related to significant unusual accounting matters. And with respect to whether there are specific elements of projects of other regulators or standard setters that we should consider, similar to Group A, I believe we didn't have any specific matters noted. Some of the other things we heard that, again, our group, I think, was relatively supportive of matters of emphasis paragraphs, and that while it might seem like a small step, we thought that there would probably be a good change generated by having that small step, and whether it focused auditors more on what was most important, or if it improved the disclosures that are referenced to include more important information, that would be, in general, a very good result and a very good first step. We did hear that it was important to strike the right balance of what was important without going overboard, and so while there was the view that it shouldn't be limited to one paragraph, we also shouldn't encourage something that was so long that the important details got masked in the level of detail presented. And another good comment was made regarding just the design and engineering of the opinion in general, and that's something we could consider as we move forward with this project, that the auditor's opinion is still the most important opinion to investors, and to be careful that it didn't get clustered among other unnecessary information, which could in effect diminish the value of the report. With that, please, if there's anyone from Group D that would like to emphasize something they said that I didn't capture, please raise your 10 card. Bob Hers.
Barb, you captured this, but there's a point that kind of building off of what Dan said about the international view, and I think some of that was in our discussion too, as to really whether or not the auditor report, the emphasis should be based upon what the auditor viewed most significant to the conduct of the audit versus what the auditor thought was most significant to investors. And there might, hopefully the two would overlap, but you know, the issue of what was the point of departure in judging significance, whether it was the audit or whether it was what the auditor thought the investors might think is most important. I think there were those, a little bit of back and forth, a little bit of in our group, you know, some people kind of, I think, framed it more from one point of view, and other people framed it from the other point of view. But listening to Dan, it seems to me that's something important just to sort out.
Is that Kevin? Kevin Riley.
Yeah, thanks, Marty, and great job, Barb. The only other thing I just wanted to emphasize coming out of the group, it wasn't a total consensus, but recognizing that this project will be a change, and we should perhaps focus on being more modest out of the gate with respect to the demands placed on the auditors to do things along these lines. See how things develop in practice, take a deep breath down the road, and consistent with what I think came out of Jessica's group, then perhaps change on the fly after we've had a chance to take a look at how it's working. So I thought that was an important concept.
Arnie?
Barbara, I thought you did a great job also. I guess the only comment I would make is that I just want to make sure that we all understand that, at least from the perspective that I believe, and I think others believed in the room, I don't know if we had a total consensus, but that it would not necessarily be fully appropriate on the auditor's part to, I'll call it opine or focus on the judgmental aspect of the accounting estimates. I think, to try to stay focused on the emphasis of where the audit was being performed, the nature of the estimates, or the nature of the areas of most significance that would provide a reader with the understanding that that these were the areas where there was significant time being spent. This is where the areas of risk from a material financial statement misstatement existed, but to fall short of necessarily providing additional context around the nature of the judgments and accruals. Again, recognizing that the financial statements are made up of significant estimates with ranges, but it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for the auditors to, because they've already given an opinion on the financial statements, that they're in accordance with GAAP, and to go further to try to provide contextual aspects around the nature of those estimates, at least my view is that that would be a one step too far.
Galen?
Yeah, just as a follow-up to, and I don't know that Barbara, I don't know that we necessarily discussed it in great detail yesterday in the breakout, but we focus on what's important, and I raised that question yesterday, important to whom? And a reasonable investor, that, and I appreciate your input on that, Jennifer, but we really need to think about who we're talking about here, because there's a wide range of investors, and I hope that wouldn't be overlooked.
It's very hard to summarize these comments, but I'm going to take a little bit of a shot. From what I heard, and maybe you all heard things differently, but notes that I was taking down was there was a reasonable amount of support for an approach that used emphasis of matters paragraphs. There wasn't a lot of support for simply just pointing to the emphasis, those footnotes, or those were just saying what the matter was. There's a desire for some commentary as to why that matter is being emphasized, why it's a matter that was most important to the audit, maybe why it should be considered most important to investors. Oftentimes, maybe those two should overlap. I think I've heard, but some commentary around that. The emphasis of matters not being tied to AS 16 specifically, but when I hear about the nature of the matters, significant unusual transactions, related parties, matters with significant judgments and estimates, complex accounting, they're matters that are discussed with the audit committee. So I think there's just some tonal aspect to that there about don't use the AS 16 necessarily as a checklist for this, but the types of things you would discuss with the audit committee are likely to be the types of things that you'd emphasize. I guess in our group, we did say, could you imagine emphasizing something in the opinion that you had not discussed with the audit committee? And it was really hard to imagine that. You might do that. It's probably the last time you'd issue a report on that client, however. Whether it's about matters in the financial statements or not in the financial statements, I think heard more comments that it's emphasis of matters about matters that are in the financial statements versus matters that are not in the financial statements. And emphasizing matters about the financial statements or about the audit, not about the audit procedures, but maybe why it's important to the audit, but really emphasizing the financial statements and what's in the financials and not audit procedures. Some other tangential benefits that seem to be mentioned from a number of different groups were, at least I heard it in a couple, that the emphasis of matters paragraphs will likely improve the audit of those critically important things that are being emphasized, and will likely improve the disclosures of those critically important things that are being emphasized. And those are benefits that are not necessarily directly related to meeting investors' needs with respect to some additional information, but I've heard a number of times that that probably is going to be an outcome of better auditing on the margin around these important matters, and on the margin, maybe some better disclosures around these important items. With respect to the point that Sam raised, and which I've heard a couple of times, that auditor, and I think it came out of another group as well, maybe it was the same group, but I know Mike was talking about it, some type of auditor reporting on other matters outside the financial statements, or an attestation on critical accounting estimates or critical accounting policies. Don't think haven't heard broad support for that. Certainly in the 150 or so letters, 155. There was not much support in the 155 letters for auditor reporting on other information outside the financial statements. And maybe Jay Hansen, I'll give you the microphone. I do think I recall you attending a conference and coming back and saying you didn't hear that as well.
A couple of us in the room here, Brian Kroger and I attended a roundtable hosted by the Center for Audit Quality maybe it was in January or so, or early in 2012. And the point was to kind of tease out some of what investors wanted around the non-financial information, and there just wasn't a lot of support for it, which kind of surprised me because I came in with the paradigm that they would want it. That was just one group, but it's a pretty wide-ranging group of investors, some preparers, some auditors.
So hard to summarize. And Joe, you made a very strong comment, which I think you used the words abject failure. I make note of words like that. But an emphasis of matters paragraph that described why it's being emphasized and the importance of it, and dealing with matters that are risks of material misstatements, significant unusual transactions, areas of particular judgment. Is that directionally the types of things that you think would be important to make this project successful?
It's hard to know, Marty, without seeing the detail of what the disclosures would have to be. I think the important thing is there needs to be meaningful new information around that, either from management or from the auditor. If all we get, as Jennifer said, is a roadmap, and as Jeff said as well, I don't think the costs, I think the benefits are going to be less than the costs in that situation. Let me briefly respond to what Jay said, because I think it's relevant. In this year's IAG meeting, Jay, we reached out to investors as well, asking them about additional involvement for the auditors in some of these other spaces that you're talking about. And some of the feedback that came back, and the board will remember this from the IAG meeting, was if auditors are not willing to communicate more to us now about what they know, given the very significant amounts that are being paid in audit fees, we're not comfortable expanding their mandate. And again, if I was an auditor, I'd be really concerned about that. This is what customers are saying.
Well, yeah, they were not necessarily saying, though, that they wanted auditor association with other information. Right. Can I just open the floor again for, this is such an important topic to us. Yeah. Happy to, at this point in time, take additional comments from anybody on any subject on this auditor's reporting model. And I have, first of all, Denny Beresford.
Just a brief comment. Marty, in your summary, you mentioned that emphasis paragraphs are likely to improve the auditing and disclosure of the items emphasized. And I think that's probably true, but keep in mind, too, that to the extent that there is going to be a lot of work that would go into the wording of emphasis paragraphs, and I think that that would involve both the senior level audit executives, senior lawyers on the side of both the company and the audit firms in many cases, that that is going to come at the cost of possibly taking away from some other aspects of the work, or adding cost, which of course is always a concern. And so there's always at least the possibility that these procedures are going to detract from other aspects of the engagement. One of the concerns that I expressed in my comment letter on the invitation to comment was the fact that we already have engagement partners spending a great deal of their time on the wrapping up aspects of the engagement and wordsmithing and things of that nature. And to the extent that they have even more of this type of activity as opposed to the good old down and dirty auditing type aspects, that I think could be of great concern to a lot of people.
Thanks, Denny. Mike Cook.
Marty, I'm just puzzled a bit. And I heard what Jay said, I heard what Joe said about investors don't want auditors necessarily to be involved with other information. But we've spent so much time talking about auditors should be addressing critical accounting policies and estimates and judgments, and that's what's in MD&A. It's not new. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's been there for, 10 years, 15 years, John. I don't know how long it's been there. It can be improved, perhaps, but the same thing is true about risk factors. Well, we'd like auditors to be engaged with risk and whether the disclosures of risk are appropriate. The disclosure of significant risks has been around for a long time, and it's part of the existing framework. The one part that doesn't quite fit that, but I think is more telling, and I won't repeat what I said before, is non-GAAP information, because this is management saying, notwithstanding this 70 pages of other stuff that we have given you to comply with one requirement or another, here are the things you really need to know about the operations of this company. So take the stuff you got in the GAAP financial statements and add this and subtract that and add these other two things, and then you'll really know how we performed last year. What would be more important to have the auditors associated with than information that takes what they live and die by, GAAP financial statements, and translates it into what management believes investors need to know to assess the performance, the future cash flows, and so on of the company. And if that is being done in a misleading way or it's not being done fairly, the auditors are the best positioned to make judgments about that. So we have these three things that are already there, and we're thrashing around trying to define new things that we ought to get people associated with. And AS16 and all the stuff that's in there, and somebody said, well, if it's important enough to talk to the audit committee about, management is talking to the audit committee about those things, not the auditors. And the auditors are saying, we agree. Or if they don't agree, they're standing up and saying so. AS16 is, again, perpetuates this myth of a two-way communication, which is not the way the world works. And most of the communication is being done by the people who are supposed to do it, which is the management of the company. So the auditors coming in at the end and saying, we talked or didn't talk to the audit committee about something is almost irrelevant if management has done its job properly. And we hope they have. But I'm just puzzled by this. Do all these people know what's in MD&A and where it came from and what it's intended to tell? And all you need to do is throw a saddle on that, put the auditor in the saddle, and you'll get them associated with management's having said, notwithstanding 49 items in significant accounting policies in Note 1, here are the 4 or 5 or 6 things you really need to know about to assess our financial reporting. What could be a better place to put the auditors?
Thanks, Mike. I think you're reacting to what I initially summarized, and I asked Jay, because I knew Jay had attended a conference, but it was my summary. And it's just a matter of fact, in our 155 comment letters, we really didn't get any support for Auditor Association. We laid that out as an alternative, so therefore...
Marty, if you don't ask the question the right way and you don't know what you're asking about, you won't get the right answer. If you're asking the question of would investors like auditors to be associated with critical accounting policies, judgments, and estimates, and the answer is no, or they're not commenting, I think you've asked the question in the wrong way, because that's exactly what people are saying they do want people to be associated with, and it's right there in MDA, and it has been for years.
Okay. Dan Slack, you had your card up for a while.
So I just wanted to follow up on what Jeff had said, Mahoney had said earlier, and I just think it's important that it should not be just a roadmap if emphasis of matter paragraphs is the path that the PCAOB goes down, that I think that it is important that there be some qualitative approach, some sort of why into the process of why this matter is emphasized. And I got a little distracted on my thoughts listening to Mike speak. It's sort of interesting about, bringing the auditors into the non-GAAP pro forma estimates or whatever. And that is an interesting concept. Maybe it's a little bit beyond this auditor's reporting model, I don't know, but I could see that in fact could be useful to us as investors.
Yeah, thanks. No, it wasn't beyond the scope of this project. In our concept release, we laid that out as one of the possibilities, Auditor Association with MD&A, and in particular, we pointed out, I think, critical accounting estimates as being an aspect of that in the concept release. So we did lay that out for investors. Jay, you want to?
Marty, just want to make a clarifying comment on some of what I heard at this roundtable I attended a number of months ago, and that was there was acknowledgement of many of the people in the room that talking about this Auditor Association with the press releases and the MD&A, that there already is involvement in most companies with the auditors actually reading the press release, and some of the context around the questions that were asked in that setting was gee, since the press release often comes long before, or at least weeks before the audit report is completed, the reporting that an auditor could do if there's actually a report being written wouldn't say a whole lot, 'cause it would say, gee, we were engaged to an audit, these numbers agree to the unaudited information, we're not done yet, and that would give limited value to investor as an additional report, but there is strong acknowledgement that there was already substantial auditor involvement in the process, and additional reporting of what that involvement was wouldn't add a lot of value.
Thanks for that clarification. I think Mike's pointed that out historically too, and my experience is that's the case as well, that there is auditor involvement in those things, but the question is reporting, as you point out. Let's hear from Brian Croto from the SEC.
Thanks very much. I was actually just going to make a similar point in reporting back from what I recall hearing back in January as well at that meeting, and very similarly, it wasn't what I wasn't hearing was that there wasn't interest in auditor involvement in that area of MD&A, but I think the starting point consideration was that auditors have a role relative to reading that information and considering material inconsistencies and material misstatement of fact today, and so the question was one more of the incremental. Now, whether an audit of that information versus what's being done today would get it better at completeness was a question that was put on the table, and I think that's a question people could continue to give consideration to, and I know that you all are giving consideration to whether any improvement or changes to the performance requirements would be appropriate relative to AU 550, but I don't think it was, what I wasn't hearing was people saying we don't want any auditor involvement or that we'd want to take away what auditors do today relative to that information, but there clearly, at least in that particular group, wasn't support for broadly expanding the auditor's role outside of audit of the financial statements and what they're required to do today under 550.
Yeah, we didn't include this in the discussion materials and as part of yesterday's item, but we are spending a lot of time on the existing standard on other information in audited documents, and maybe potentially clarifying in the auditor's report what that auditor's responsibility is, and maybe auditors saying something about that if we can figure out the right tools and mechanism to do that. But we're definitely working on that aspect of of other information accompanying the audited financial statements. A lot of cards up here in the center of the room that I see, but let's start with John White, and then maybe over to Arnie and Steve Rafferty. Is that no? Arnie and Jerry de Saint-Pierre.
I'm probably just repeating what Jay and Brian said. I was actually moderating that session, and we basically spent 6 hours with 30 investors in the room, and the real question we were asking was, should there be expanded auditor association with MD&A and press releases? And I'll have to say, very much to my surprise, there was kind of a resounding no. Just to emphasize, I mean, it was just, I was really quite, I was very surprised. I'll have to say, just from my personal experience of being involved with MD&A and press releases and so on, and non-GAAP measures, that when auditors are in the room and they're part of the dialogue, I think the disclosures get better. But they're just, there was not, I mean, there was certainly support for the existing association with those, with press releases and MD&A, but not that there should be an expanded association with them. I was very surprised.
We were equally surprised because we laid it out as one of the possibilities in the concept release, and were very surprised by the lack of support in the 155 comment letters. So it's a resounding no is what we're hearing. Arnie and then Steve and then Jerry.
So just a couple of comments maybe to build upon what Mike Cook was saying. I agree with Mike that, and I know the document AS 16 talks about two-way communication, but I fully agree that it's really a three-way communication effort, and that, you know, I as management have that responsibility first and foremost to communicate with the audit committee as to the issues around my financial statements. The auditors, they complement what I'm communicating, and certainly have every opportunity and every right to agree or disagree, provide additional color commentary, to expand upon my discussion and disclosures with the audit committee. But I don't think we need to not lose sight of the fact that management has that responsibility first and foremost, and to infer that the auditor should be stepping into the shoes of management, I think is, and I know you're not saying that, but I just
Nobody's
think,
making that inference, and
no,
that's not what
AS
16 says, Arnie. So
I just think we need to keep that at the forefront. I think that the focus again should be on objective perspectives. I think if this is a matter of emphasis paragraph, which I do support the matter of emphasis paragraph, that it needs to be an emphasis on where the time is being spent and where areas within the audit. I think it needs to stay away from the qualitative assessments. As I've said, I think that there are ways working with the SEC, if there are issues around the critical accounting policies and people are not describing within their critical accounting policies the appropriate risks or the appropriate quantitative analysis for the reader to understand the changes in those estimates and what can cause those estimates to change based upon the risks assessments, the various assumptions that go into those determination of the accounting accruals and other aspects of our financial statements. If we're not describing that appropriately with the required quantitative deviations that I believe are very clear and required within the scope of providing critical accounting policies, then I think the SEC has a responsibility to call us on the carpet and provide and push us to have more appropriate disclosure within the critical accounting policies that I believe will make the investors and provide the investors with reasonable and significant information around, again, the range of outcomes that can occur and the impact that could occur if we've missed our estimates by 5 or 10%. At least sufficient analysis to determine what a different answer would be within our financial statements. So I think a lot of it already exists And to create something new other than maybe providing the reader with where is the auditor spending their time and the emphasis and why they are spending their time there, and providing some context as to the framework for their scope and their audit plan, I think would be going too far. Thank you.
Thanks, Ernie. Steve?
Yeah, as I've listened to this discussion, I think we have to appreciate the fact that investors are telling us that they want and need additional information. And as I listened to all of the panel's report, there seems to be something of a common theme on the kinds of information that they want, being identifying material estimates and why those estimates might change, to Arnie's point, other matters that might give rise to future volatility in financial statements and what those uncertainties are, critical accounting estimates, material uncertainties, unusual transactions and events, perhaps even information about going concern. I would boil that down to investors wanting more information about the subjectivity and volatility in the financial statements, potentially in the future. And I think it'd be hard to disagree that there shouldn't be some kind of an emphasis of a matter paragraph around that kind of stuff. But I think one of the big struggles that we're going to have here, if we stick to the principle that auditors shouldn't be providing original information, is that's going to be hard to do in an auditor's report. It's almost an emphasis of a matter paragraph or footnote in the financial statement for that to be original information from management. And I think while you can argue that that information exists today, it's fragmented. Some of that information is in the financials, some of it's outside the financials, some of it's perhaps not required at all. But I think investors might be saying, put that one place in the financial statements where I can read about the uncertainty and volatility of these financial statements. And I realize that maybe is a perfect world and requires standard setting beyond the scope of what the PCAOB can do, but I would encourage you to think about pursuing that if it is perhaps more of an ideal answer. And then I appreciate the fact that investors might also want auditors' evaluation of that, of those disclosures. And I wouldn't think there would perhaps be anything wrong with modifying the auditor's report to specify that the auditor has in fact evaluated the disclosures around uncertainty and volatility of financial statements and report that those disclosures are in fact adequate based upon the extent of the audit work performed.
Thanks, Steve. We have Jerry and then Steve Holmesa and Robin Kravitz. And I think after that we'll be due for a break.
Thank you, Marty. I just had 2 points that I think came out of our group, but one item was only mentioned by our group and another that was mentioned in a couple that I think are worthy of your consideration for inclusion in your sort of summary, overall summary. The first was the discussion that a couple of groups have talked to, and that is identifying the target of who we're trying to benefit with this. Who is the investor? And in our group, and I think that's worthy of some consideration, our group, I don't remember who it was, it may have been Gary who recommended using the FASB bar for that, which is fairly high. It's a fairly sophisticated investor, but I do think it's useful for us in terms of trying to target where we're going to pitch this to understand the audience that we're pitching it to. That's the first point. The second point I thought really made a lot of sense was the idea of field testing. I have to say it was not my idea, so this isn't something I'm promoting. But it came up in our group, and I really think it's a good idea to pick a few companies, go back, take a few years, and see if you can kind of get a sense in a real way of what you would be looking at to inform the process. Some field testing.
Great, thanks, Jerry. Steve?
Thanks, Marty. I just wanted to suggest that perhaps as I sit here and listen to this discussion, there was a role for internal auditors to provide more assurance around information about risks and MD&A and so on and so forth. I hear a lot of gray through this discussion, so it may be appropriate, maybe, kind of a compromise position between the investor world that is clamoring for more information and additional insurance and auditors that may not be able to provide that. Perhaps some responsibility could rest with internal auditors because they are inside the companies. They know the companies very well. And I think in the public company world, especially at that level, they're staffed with CPAs, certified internal auditors, and that have a deep background in business, that come from major accounting firms, regulators, so on and so forth. So I think that point is perhaps worthy of some consideration in this process.
How do you see that working? IAA coming up with a proposal, or companies
that
voluntarily asking their auditors to do that, or what?
That would be my suggestion for the PCAOB and the IA Institute of Internal Auditors to work together to come up with something around that. I understand that the IA have in front of me the comment letter to the concept release dated September 30th of last year, and it is one suggestion in that letter.
Thank you. Robin, I think you get the last word.
Great. I know this is beyond, that I'm speaking to the PCAOB here, and this may be beyond scope, but in our breakout session, I mentioned, and I think there was some support for the fact that really the audit committee's role, I mean, I understand that investors are clamoring for more information, and I'm sympathetic to that, but maybe it's the audit committee's role to provide emphasis and additional information, because after all, it's the audit committee that hears from internal audit. It's the audit committee that has robust discussions with external auditors. And to decide where to point investors might be better placed in the audit committee's scope, working with the SEC. So I just throw that solution out as opposed to mandating certain information.
Thanks, Robin. And of course, as Jennifer commented yesterday, the FRC in the UK has gone down that route with expanded audit committee reporting on their process and what they've done in the oversight of financial statements and the audit, and to make some commentary about financial statements and the audit, and then for the auditor to actually report on the fairness of the audit committee report. So there is a model for that in the UK. We've had a very, very lively discussion with many points of view, both yesterday afternoon and continued this morning on this subject. So we've got a lot of input, that's for sure. Thanks for this discussion. We'll take a break. Let's try to be back in about 15 minutes and hear the discussion about the outreach on fraud, and to have another discussion about that. Thank you. You're kind of my right-hand man person. What? Thanks.
Check, check. 1, 2. Please, we'd like to resume the meeting since we've already lost some time on this last session. So if you can take your seats, we'll be starting momentarily. Thank you.
Before I get started, I've had a lot of compliments both yesterday and today about the organization of the meeting, the structure of the layouts here and the breakout room and how things have gone, and nice dinner last night. And none of that could be accomplished without the great help of some people on our team. And out by the doorway are Tyling Bloomfield, Lucia Caramba, and Sharon Pickens. And Morris Hendricks is not here, but Morris would be part of the team too, so please thank them. Thank you very much for the great job you all do. Okay, we're going to do a similar thing in this session as we did in the last one, and that is hear from each of the groups in terms of what they heard with respect to outreach, with respect to potential outreach, with respect to consideration of fraud and the auditor's responsibilities. And so Group A was led by Brian Degano was in that group. So Brian, it's yours.
Thanks, Marty. Our group had Marty, myself, Steve Harris, and Lou Ferguson, and we had a very dynamic discussion, which allowed for a lot of interaction amongst all the participants in the group. And as to question one, should the board conduct outreach, overall, there was an agreement that outreach or other research should be performed. However, the focus of those efforts should not be limited solely to fraud detection. No strong views emerged as to whether the form of the outreach should be done through a SAG task force or through roundtables. The format of our discussion resulted in us discussing questions 2, 3, and 4 together. So I'll talk through the overall thoughts that came from different group members. Among other things, the group members noted that the cost-benefit trade-off of any additional audit procedures should be considered. Any efforts to do additional research to take into account the existing standard-setting agenda. And a big theme that emerged was whether or not we're missing the bigger picture with the questions that we asked, and whether a more holistic focus on audit quality could provide a better opportunity to improve overall audit quality, because improving audit quality overall would improve the detection of fraud. And members noted that there could be research regarding audit quality and fraud. And the focus of any research performed regarding audit quality could consider the following topics: doing a systemic analysis of lessons learned from audit failures, that is, what went wrong in those audit failures, noting that audit failures where there was fraud is not really in a different universe from overall audit failures. Similar deficiencies are often noted in audit failures where there is no fraud. It's just that management wasn't committing fraud. In both cases, the auditor failed to get sufficient evidence to support their opinions. Audit quality research could also consider some efforts undertaken by the IAASB right now, including their audit quality framework, and could focus on audit quality and firm quality control issues, including professional skepticism. And in that regard, more guidance could be encouraged on professional skepticism. We should consider the potential tension between client service and professional skepticism, and whether compensation incentives may not actually be encouraging professional skepticism. Another topic for audit quality research includes thinking about how firms address competence and training and education of auditors. One concern that was raised was whether or not qualified auditors are actually leaving the industry in larger proportions than in previous years. There was a lot of thoughts on the focus of research performed regarding fraud as well. And those thoughts included that firms want additional guidance in identifying best practices and detecting fraud because this will help to protect them against litigation. There were suggestions to reach out to forensic auditors and fraudsters. This could identify practical examples to inform auditors and at the same time help them to consider when to perform enhanced audit procedures. There could also be outreach to analysts and short sellers, and there should be some efforts undertaken to consider why analysts and short sellers are able to identify fraud using public informations. This could have the potential to identify some procedures that could be included in the auditing standards. There could also be outreach to other organizations that deal with fraud, such as fraud examiners. Another theme that was brought up and discussed to consider in regarding fraud research is whether we're taking advantage of all the information that we currently have access to understand the root causes of audit failure and thereby improve audit quality. So consider doing a systemic study of audit failures where fraud existed to identify whether there's commonalities among companies that are committing fraud, and to consider whether or not fraud may be a smaller issue post Sarbanes-Oxley. There was also discussion on evaluating our information sharing practices with the SEC, in particular to consider whether we're maximizing the obtaining information sharing with the SEC to understand where and why fraud is being committed. We could also consider our process for obtaining information from audit firms directly. One member noted that the AICPA's SEC practice section used to require audit firms to provide insight into all lawsuits that were filed against them, and to discuss what happened and how the firm was addressing those problems. And another person also mentioned that the example that's been used before about the NTSB and their evaluation of plane crashes is an example that we should look to for our information sharing with firms. Members also noted that we should be considering what techniques have been used by auditing firms that are successful, which may not be being noted publicly. So in efforts where they are doing a good job in fraud, having them share that information with us to share those best practices with other firms. And as to question 5, whether the scope of the outreach and research should be extended to broker-dealers, yes, there was thoughts in the group that a consideration of issues regarding audits of brokers and dealers should also be included. And with that, I'd invite any members of Group A who'd like to add to those thoughts to
I was in Group A, so I'll throw in a few cents. Just have to have somebody put up their 10 cards. I forgot to do that, sorry. I think that although there was some support for outreach, it was clearly, at least in our group, it was don't limit it to outreach with respect to the auditor's responsibility to fraud. It's take all the tools you have, and maybe there are tools you could have, and consider improving audit quality further. And as you can take all these tools to improve audit quality, that should naturally improve the auditor's ability to detect fraud. So I think the outreach there was agreement about outreach, but it was really about ways in which you can use existing tools to identify ways to improve audit quality. And then on the point you made, Brian, is just to emphasize that, there was a discussion that the items that show up in Part 1 of PCAOB inspection reports, where the auditors fail to do something important, that often is the case in a particular fraud that's not uncovered, that the auditor failed to do that particular procedure as well, except they weren't quite as lucky that management was honest in the first case and not honest in the second case. So, pouring through the nature of our Part 1 findings to gain more understanding about audit quality problems, again should lead us to ability to find ways to improve the auditor's ability to detect fraud. So that's just some clarifications from my part, which triggered Arnie to have some thoughts here.
So I guess, and maybe you said this, Brian, but, and by the way, I thought you captured everything nicely, but we seem to spend a lot of time on, I'll call it the process, and the ability that you all have to even get to the root cause of existing frauds. And it seemed to me that there were some barriers that were there, either imposed by the SEC or others from an enforcement perspective to we analogized it to when there was an aircraft crash and, you know, people descend on it to try to get to the root cause of the problems. And it seemed like there were barriers that you all had in order to try to get to the root cause of a number of these things in a timely manner. So it seemed like there, and I don't know if it's within your purview to modify this, but, you know, again, some suggestions as far as working with other organizations, other elements of government to attempt to get to the information more quickly, more timely, and really truly get to the root cause. And then also, we did spend a lot of time, I think, some time talking about there needed to be more current studies post Sarbanes-Oxley. So.
Some of those matters Arnie's referring to, and I'll do my best to try to comment on them. For instance, if we bring an enforcement action in case of fraudulent financial reporting, that action is by law private, and that information is confidential for an extended period of time while through an appeals process. And that was one point that we just can't go in and say, here's what happened, and let that information be used for best practices, because we're not permitted to by law. A second case that was pointed out was that in not all financial reporting frauds are we investigating the audit. In many cases, the SEC is investigating both the issuer and the auditor. So it was just, we're not involved in all of them also. So that was some of the areas I think that were pointed out. Maybe there were others.
The other area was that we talked about that there's probably issues that auditors uncover that don't rise to the level where they would be significant or material. And again, some dialogue with auditors to try to understand what it is they're seeing that may not rise to that level of materiality that they've uncovered or conversations they've had within companies. Again, as an extra part of your outreach effort to try to understand root causes.
Looks like you did a very good job, Brian. Thanks. The next group would be Dima Andrienko is going to report on that matter.
Thanks, Marty. In Group B from the PCAOB, we had Jay Hansen, Greg Jonas, and Greg Skates, and myself. On question one, on whether the board should conduct outreach, I think the general sentiment was that the risk of fraud is an ongoing issue, and therefore consideration of this risk should also be an ongoing process. And this ongoing initiative would include accumulating and constantly or continuously updating information about financial statement frauds, including information about the company and also information about the audit process. At the same time, sort of on the flip side, it's also important to gather and analyze information about audit successes in identifying ongoing frauds at various stages of those frauds, sort of best practices. That information would allow to identify specific audit practice issues, and those practice issues could be analyzed and fully explored by a task force, for example. It would also allow to communicate how ongoing frauds were detected before they resulted in material misstatements in financial statements. In other words, instances in which the auditors did the right thing. It would also allow to develop training initiatives that would include focus on fraud detection in particular. Another view that was expressed, or a suggestion for the PCAOB, is that other organizations, for example, some advocacy groups, they already have fraud risk initiatives. So the PCAOB, it was recommended that the PCAOB first would be aware of these initiatives and also to engage in an ongoing dialogue with these groups. On the question of who should the board reach out to in any data gathering or other initiatives, we had a long list, and some of this sort of echoes the views that are expressed in Group A discussion. So that would be SEC Enforcement, SEC Corp Fin, Department of Justice, also short sellers and analysts were mentioned, white-collar crime experts, insurance brokers and carriers, internal auditors, forensic accountants, business press, and also the SEC's whistleblower task force. On the question of whether any research in the area of fraud detection is needed, there are several points made. One was that a good research program would, A, inform any future initiatives in this area and also help focus the board's resources. So, for instance, it would help identify the extent of any existing problem, such as, for instance, a particular type of fraud. And also, it would help suggest the most effective ways of addressing any such problem. It would also help in anticipating any emerging issues. And some in our group felt strongly that that's very important. It would be very helpful for auditors. And it would help auditors to be more proactive in identifying and addressing fraud, financial statement fraud. Another area of research was the implementation of the PCAOB's risk assessment standards. Somebody mentioned that the existing research spans the period before and after the PCAOB came into existence, and would be very interesting to look at and analyze data that has been gathered after some of the PCAOB standards were issued and adopted by the auditors. Also, another area of research was the implication of having this new category of companies, emerging growth companies, to which a different set of regulatory requirements apply than to the other issuers. Another area of research was also the role of technology in both committing fraud and in fraud detection. On the question of what should be the areas of focus, there's, again, a broad range of views. One suggestion was to start with the existing, with the auditor's current responsibilities. In other words, the reasonable assurance the auditor is required to provide. And then focus on how to make the auditor more effective in detecting fraud. Points were made that in many instances there are red flags in the audits, and auditors have missed those flags because they did not exercise a critical enough mindset. For instance, because many auditors, they just did not take part in audits in which frauds were detected and subsequently explored and addressed by auditors. Any of the fraud detection skills that are learned or they're taught and learned in training, the auditors, they do not have a chance to apply them, so to speak, directly, and they diminish over time. And also, a different point, many junior auditors, they utilize sort of a checklist mentality, and some of them may be intimidated by management. Another area of focus, or two areas of focus that are sort of complementary, one is to study large frauds and to identify common threads in those frauds and also potential gaps in the audit practice. The other one was to study characteristics of smaller frauds. Those should not be ignored because you can identify root causes that may be relevant in larger frauds. And finally, on the question of the approach, suggested approach to dealing with the broker-dealer group, I think the group was in agreement that broker-dealers should be considered separately. A big part of this community is non-public and non-custodial entities, and therefore certain fraud attributes and parameters that are identified with respect to issuers, they may or may not be relevant to that group. So it requires separate consideration in that group. And a good suggestion was made that the results of the PCAOB interim inspection program with respect to auditors of broker-dealers should inform any fraud risk initiatives for broker-dealer community. With that, I would like to open the floor for members of our Group B, and please feel free to expand on any other points that I mentioned in my summary. Thanks.
Danny Beresford.
For the second time at this meeting, I am mystified as to why there was no reference to the Fraud Center. We had extensive mention of the Fraud Center during our discussion, and everything that Dina just mentioned was perfectly appropriate, but a lot of it was couched in the context of if the PCAOB would move forward, on establishing a fraud center. Much of this research could be done on an ongoing basis and could be accumulated in that format. And I guess I'm speaking on behalf of Barbara Roper, who is not here today as well, but I think that there was much support among the group. In fact, I don't recall hearing anyone who spoke against the concept, and I'm again a little mystified. Maybe somehow or another there is some PCAOB move against it, but that was certainly something that was mentioned extensively during our discussion.
Chairman Doty?
Just to confirm, we do see it. I certainly see this task force and the kind of constructive suggestions that are coming up here as a step, a very definite and useful step in developing the prospectus and the plan for a fraud center in a way that will relate it integrally and directly to the programs of the board. I'm reminded of something some chief executive I once heard say: we can do everything, we just can't do everything at once. And I think for us at the board, the fraud center kind of falls in that category. We're going to be coping, as we said earlier, with economic analysis, ECCF, with the agenda that Marty, the very ambitious agenda that he's laid out in the top 5 items that he has. But I think this is going to be a very helpful comment, Denny, a very helpful comment to the process you've just made, and we will get this, I think, in a shape to make a positive contribution to actually implementing a fraud center.
Steve Holmesen.
Just wanted to underline one point that Dima mentioned, and that is the importance of taking advantage of electronic tools, of technology, of data analytics, which could enable auditors to expand their capacity greatly by more extensive coverage of larger populations, of a higher quality of coverage. And I think there's a lot of untapped potential in that area that is important to be explored.
Greg Fletcher, Group C.
Okay, thank you, Marty. Included in Group C was Keith Wilson and Jeanette Franzel. So our group concluded the board should conduct preliminary outreach, but the objective would be to take a broad, holistic approach involving others, because fraud is not just an audit problem, it's really a problem with the financial reporting process. And similar to the other groups, the broad objective would be for the outreach to be exploratory, to gather data, define issues, and test the hypothesis about whether or not the PCAOB needs a bigger or a broader project to address fraud, like a standard-setting project. In keeping with the theme of data gathering, we felt like there was a need for some baseline research about the prevalence of fraud that's occurred since the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And this research should be updated on a continuous basis, well, not continuous, but maybe like an annual basis, so that we'd be able to tell for sure if fraud was going up or down, and you could respond accordingly. And to continue monitoring firms' compliance with the fraud requirements and the risk assessment standards, because as was pointed out yesterday, those standards became effective about a year ago, and we're just now starting to inspect against them. But try to accumulate some baseline data about the auditor's compliance with the existing standards before we move forward with another project. And also to continue to consider whether we should build fraud procedures into our projects, our standard setting projects going forward. And the outreach could also be of a more tactical area. We talked, Dima talked about it also, looking at frauds post-mortem as to what caused the frauds, did the auditor miss the fraud, if so, why? And then some conclusions about whether this type of fraud is episodic or it's just a one-time isolated type approach. I think we had more support for a roundtable than for a task force, but nothing really conclusive in our group. The second question was about the composition of the outreach, and in keeping with our theme, belief, strong support for outreach being more than just auditors, and some of the same people that were mentioned earlier. They would include bank and insurance regulators, the SEC, corporate governance organizations, certified fraud examiners, internal audit, exchanges, data mining services. And we also felt there's a great need to have some international representation there because we just need to take into account the international considerations. The culture might be different, the environment might be different, the auditing might be different, and some frauds occurring overseas are starting to migrate back towards the United States. It was pointed out that the confirmation type frauds with SADIAM and Parmalat are now starting to occur in the United States. Differing views about including the short sellers. While it was agreed that the short sellers did a great job of identifying frauds, it was pointed out that sometimes they don't have the best success rate. They can, for example, identify 10 companies where they think there's fraud, and if 2 or 3 of those turn out the way they want them to come out, they'll make money and it'll be a success for them, but perhaps maybe not as much of an example of their ability to pick losers. And heard some cautions about including fraudsters on the panel. The idea was these fraudsters are criminals. They could be reformed criminals. They've hit the lecture circuit. A couple of well-known lecturers are now back in prison again, and to be careful about who we'd like to have associated with the PCAOB official body and who we're taking advice from. In terms of research, I pretty much mentioned all the research that I think the main thing was this baseline research about the prevalence of fraud that's occurring, empirical research. In terms of focus areas, the group felt like it was really too soon to come up with new focus areas, but they felt like there was a lot of tools and procedures the auditors had available to them right now they could use. For example, frauds frequently start small and grow, so you have to look at materiality differently for a fraud than you would for any other type of misstatements. And more professional skepticism could identify fraud, and that perhaps we should change, corroborate management's assertions to challenge them. And we had some wonderful personal examples of how professional skepticism and challenging of management uncovered some actual things that were going wrong. And auditors should focus on controls, the basic controls that are designed to detect fraud, which would be things like segregation of duties and limitations of authority. And I think that also we talked a little bit about confirmations and how maybe you need some alternatives to confirmations, because confirmations only work if you have a trustworthy and diligent person at the other end completing the confirmation. And then finally, we talked a little bit about forensic procedures, and it felt like you should, whether to apply forensic procedures, it's something that's available now based on the auditor's risk assessment. And if you feel like you have a particularly risky area, it might be a good idea to apply some risk assessment procedures there. And then finally, with respect to broker-dealers, we felt that they had special considerations like custody of assets and net capital. For example, with net capital, you could have a very low net capital, but at the same time, the company could still have a custody over hundreds of millions of dollars of customer assets. So again, you have to look at materiality differently for brokers and dealers, and they should be treated separately, and that any outreach related to broker-dealers, we should go to the people who have expertise, like the auditors who specialize in that and the regulators of broker-dealers. So with that, I'd like to open up the floor to the members of Group C.
Greg, I greatly appreciate the advice that we should be careful who we associate with. So that was very valuable. That there's plenty of advice we can get. We get very valuable advice, and we can do a lot of good research. So that was an excellent point of many out of your group. Professor Cox.
A couple of the reports have mentioned about looking at matters post-SOX, and I'm just going to point out a couple of data points about that, why I think that's likely not to be useful. The Jobs Act, first of all, raised the reporting requirements from 500 to 2,000, and therefore removed a little over 2,000 of the companies that are so-called 12G companies from the reporting roles. and being an issuer is the operative word for SOX. So whatever happened for that group before is not happening now, okay? So that's one thing. The other thing is because the non-accelerated filers who may be listed and therefore technically a reporting company, that the 404B requirement has never applied to them and doesn't apply going forward. And so if you think that that meets anything in detecting fraud, I happen to be one of those people, and I think all the studies indicate it does, that's not. So I think, you have to be a little careful about thinking about what happened post 2002, because we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto, okay?
Gary, did you want to respond to that?
I know we're not in Kansas. Thanks, Marty. We had a really good group yesterday. My compliments, to Greg for leading us. Just a couple of thoughts I had made during it is, as I look at, if you're going to do outreach and do we have a special project on auditors' responsibility for fraud, if it sort of runs the course of a normal standard setting project, it's going to take a while, and that's fine. But I think the more and more I think about it as sort of an operational finance person, a lot of these frauds still go back to basics. I mean, Greg had mentioned it, and things you can work on today, whether it's in your inspections, whether it's in practice alerts or whatever, segregation of duties, spans of control, he had mentioned, the tone at the top, basic nuts and bolts, controls over who can touch the ledger, who can put in a vendor on your payables master file, your receivables master file. Those things work. I mean, they're not going to stop everything, to be sure, but they absolutely do work. And to the extent, I know there's a standards project on auditor confirmations. I think a lot of those things, perhaps these things need to be modernized, re-emphasized, perhaps refocused, but a lot of stuff, it already exists today, the cures. And when you get managers who got, I'll call it, special privileges to go outside of established corporate procedures, they have their own little supply chain as opposed to, following the established one, for the company as a whole. The red flags are there, and a lot of basic nuts and bolts, blocking and tackling can do the job well, not all. I also think there's corporate level frauds or deliberate management bias, being careful, being selective in what you choose to disclose. I mean, that's a different sort of fraud, maybe not even a fraud, as opposed to just best balling to the extreme. And I think that's different than people who actually got their hands on the ledger. So again, they're all part of the fraud umbrella. They're just different. They're different problems and might require different solutions.
Thanks. A lot of good comments, and I think it's similar to a comment that I heard in my group about work on audit quality, and I think that point came across a couple of times. Bob Hirth.
I wanted to add that in addition to standard setting and revising the standard and doing outreach and research, which can take some time and be very valuable, I think the PCAOB has already demonstrated its ability to issue guidance on a timely basis and really help people think through things, though maybe not require it yet under the formal standard setting process. The great example to date is around the inspection process, explaining what that is. So I think there's an opportunity because, financial statement fraud is going on today as we speak. So I think there's an opportunity to use the timeliness of, guidance, if you will, to get more information out on this. It might be example forensic procedures. It might be, different things. So I'd like to suggest that that's an opportunity to move the ball forward a bit faster, perhaps.
Yeah, good ideas. Bill Platt.
Yeah, Marty, and I'm going to use an analogy, but I guess I would say that I still think that, and it was talked about in our group, if the objective is to reduce the level of fraudulent financial reporting, then to focus just on better auditing as a solution to that is helpful, but doesn't really make the biggest contribution to it. So I might use an example. And I guess I would say the seeds of fraud are not fraud yet. And if we were to compare it to, take you're planting a garden, and there happen to be weed seeds there, you might put pre-emergent weed control down. You might put some hay or something else over, I guess, straw. You wouldn't put hay because hay will grow weeds, right? Straw down to stop the weeds from growing. And lastly, when all else fails and the weeds get too tall and they're choking out your nice vegetables, you'll go out and do the hard labor of manually pulling the weeds out. I would suggest that the auditor is the weed puller. And there are other things that can reduce fraud from occurring before the weed puller gets there. And granted, there'll be still some weeds that come up, and we need to do good auditing to find those. But the kinds of things that that were mentioned to say, what are the kinds of things that systemically can be put in organizations, control systems, culture to reduce the level of fraud, combined with better weed pulling, I think is the way to attack it, not just to overwhelm the weed pullers by letting a whole bunch of weeds grow and then telling them to work harder to get them pulled. So more holistic approach, I think, is this, if any topic, I think this is one that is worthy of a more holistic approach to looking at with other bodies outside the PCAOB.
And many are aware, I think it came up in a couple of meetings yesterday, that there are some other groups looking at this from a multidimensional facet, and I think that's very beneficial, but good advice for us too. I was wondering though if you were putting that into your brochures on campus about the weed pullers or not. Mike's hoping you do, I think. Any more cards from that group? Okay, I don't think so. The fourth group is led by Chris Jetness.
Thanks, Marty. I just first want to say that our group had a lot of very interesting discussion, and definitely appreciate everybody's input. From the PCAOB, it included Jim Doty, Jennifer Rand, in addition to myself. I'll just jump into question one, whether or not we should conduct outreach. And I think there was a general agreement amongst our group members that we indeed should conduct outreach. The group seemed generally supportive of establishing a task force to conduct such outreach. However, it's important to have a holistic approach. And so that includes, pulling in preparers, pulling in forensic accountants, pulling in listening to the board of directors and others. Also, it's important that a task force should not be formed without a very clear scope and objective. And so that needs to be established before any further action is taken. In terms of particular organizations or individuals that we could pull into this effort, in addition to those stakeholders mentioned already, our groups seem to focus on some, in addition to the people that have already been mentioned by my colleagues as well, some other types of individuals, including compensation committees or including compensation consultants. They will have a lot of knowledge about the compensation structures that a lot of times maybe start the weed from growing, basically, plant the weed. And we can look to see how, what kind of compensation structures are out there that really enable the fraud to start. And so that was an interesting thought. Another one was to pull in behavioral psychologists. Similarly, that's another group that would look for personal incentives for fraud. Short sellers and analysts were also mentioned in our group. I think our groups seem to be a bit more skeptical when it came to short sellers for some of the same reasons mentioned before, because their motives are really different from an auditor, and so they're looking to find opportunities to sort of bring company maybe looking for someone that's going to go down, and so they might not necessarily be focused on fraud. In terms of analysts, if they are to be used, we should look at the buy side rather than the sell side. Whistleblowers, fraudsters were also mentioned. Fraudsters, though, I think, as Marty pointed out, there might be some issues there. So the Center for Audit Quality and their anti-fraud collaboration was certainly brought up as well, and all the work that they do with FEI and others. The Risk Fin division of the SEC was brought up in our group, which I know we've talked a lot about the SEC, but that was another division within the SEC that might provide some guidance for us. And the FBI was brought up as well. In terms of is research needed, then, again, I think the general consensus was that yes, research is needed. One idea was to look at business practices in different countries, because again, the notion that fraud might be perpetrated in different ways around the world and based on different motives is important to get around and get a handle on. Also, research cost of fraud to the overall capital markets rather than just the individual companies, and as well as the change in the cost of fraud over time. We should also look at what tools are available to deconstruct past frauds, to find consistent themes or patterns, which has been mentioned here as sort of a post-mortem analysis of frauds that have been done in the past. But caution was also put on that as the past might not always be a prologue to the future, and facts and circumstances at each individual company might be different. We should also look at how to leverage new tools to audit in the 21st century. And finally, there was a suggestion that we should look at the tone at the top and specifically the 7 drivers of ethical business practices that sort of separate some companies that are doing things well from those that are doing things less well. As the top quartile, it was noted, were 3 times of companies were 3 times less likely to have fraud than the bottom quartile companies using these 7 drivers. Now, I personally would need to look into those 7 drivers. That was a good suggestion. In terms of the focus of the outreach and research, I think we as a group came away with, I think it was more important to establish the scope and the objective through the outreach and research before you really delve into what the specific areas of focus may or may not be. And we need to understand where the fraud is likely to occur, understand the DNA, so to speak, of fraud, and where the next fraud might be coming from through our outreach and research efforts. However, some areas that kept coming up, though, throughout the discussion related to enhancing professional skepticism and required training. So, similar to some of the other groups that have gone before me here today. On the final question on broker-dealers and whether or not they should be included or sort of looked at separately, we think the consensus was we should include them, but note that they are different. They have different issues, such as the misappropriation of customer assets, and so that needs to be looked at, with a different light, and potentially also looked at in combination with other institutions that also hold customer assets, such as banks, investment advisors, trusts, credit unions, to the extent that they are issuers, of course. And with that, open the floor up for discussion.
Chuck Senator. I was about to call on you before the card went up.
In the spirit of Bill Platt's well-tended garden, I think there's a real opportunity, and we talked about this in the group in terms of the ethics space. And we're all aware that auditing standards 12 calls on auditors to do an inquiry into the culture for ethics and integrity in a company, particularly of senior management, and to determine the level of understanding and how well developed the culture is. And there have been some very, very interesting developments in the field in terms of being able to actually measure attributes that companies have that do this well. And there's data that shows, and Chris was alluding to it, where for companies in the top quartile that have certain attributes and have certain badges and are attentive to certain drivers, that observed misconduct that reported by employees is actually lower by a factor of 3x when you're looking at fraudulent behavior than would be in the lower quartile companies. And so it struck me that in thinking about a more holistic approach in terms of how an auditor can approach it, and I by no means suggested this is an auditor's responsibility, but it seems to me that an auditor, particularly dealing with the audit committee and in conversations about thinking about engagement risk, thinking about giving feedback in terms of how management might be able to be more attentive to these issues, can create some structure around it as opposed to simply going 100% by gut. So the view is that there may be a research opportunity to look at these top quartile companies. The drivers are established in the research, but the interesting thing to see would be what are the badges of things that these companies do. I mean, there are different things that companies do to approach this, but if we can collect that, it may provide some objective framework for auditors in assessing engagement risk and having conversations with audit committees to gauge the level of auditing that needs to be done in terms of testing levels, and B, to hopefully begin a more significant feedback opportunity for the companies over time, to where more companies begin to exhibit these behaviors and, as a consequence, lower the risk of fraud.
Wayne Collins.
Thanks, Marty. Chris, great summary. And you mentioned looking into business practices in different countries. I think even beneath that, we're looking at the different cultures that generate the different business practices. It's important to know what kind of drivers there are that may not be familiar to us in the U.S.
That's obviously becoming more important all the time, that factor, as we see with various different frauds being committed. So, very valuable point. This is Steve Buller.
Thanks, Marty, and thank you, Chris, for the summary. It was very good. I think one suggestion we also had in our group was, as you're setting your scope, just keep in mind how broad you want the definition of fraud, because there are a number of activities which may not result in a direct or immediate impact upon financial statements, and some of those might be theft of intellectual property or theft of employee information, and we just need to think about how broad that is. And one thing in the financial services industry, too, a lot of companies now are identifying fraud risk officers that have a particular role in identifying fraud, and also working in other aspects where fraud may be relevant, including SOX and whistleblower and other procedures. Second thing we talked about, which Chris mentioned briefly, is the Fraud Center. And I think the thing which we felt is, while it's definitely would have benefit to auditors, it also would have benefit to preparers of financial information and users and analysts in helping them to identify what they should be looking for also. Not that we're trying to help the short sellers, but very importantly, I think that we want to be part of a community of informed decision makers. And then lastly, just again to clarify, Chris's comment on the need to focus on kind of a special niche for banks and asset managers and custodians and trust companies and those firms that are involved in financial services is there really are some entities that have significant custodial and investment and financial transactional activities, and a higher risk of misappropriation of customer assets or firm capital. And money moves very fast. And any time you can wire money out quickly, which all institutions can do, but especially in these institutions, the touch points are very sensitive, and we probably need to have that focus as a special effort. Thank you.
Steve, if I can put you on the spot, being in the same group, but you mentioned one point, and I'm glad you mentioned it. It was defining fraud. And I recall yesterday you were explaining just kind of different considerations at BlackRock and what would be in and what out. And I think if you don't mind just talking about that briefly, I think that might be helpful.
Well, just the background we had is we just went through a year-long analysis of how we define fraud in terms of setting up a fraud risk function and a fraud risk officer. It was very problematic because there are many definitions out there, and we started to work with our attorneys to try to define what the role of the FRO would be, including escalation of fraud. We found that it had to have a very strong interaction with our analysts, and our analysts actually had a lot of input into what they were looking at. But what we realize is what our analysts do is they really look for corporate governance, and looking for good corporate governance is not the same as looking for fraud. And in many cases, you're voting on a company with poor corporate governance and higher risk of fraud by just not investing, and that's not necessarily the best way to identify the high fraud risk factors.
Let me give it back to Brian, and maybe you can give us your thoughts as to how we pull this together. I see some of the folks have to make flights and things like that. We promised a 12 o'clock finish, but we do want to hear you maybe try to pull this together for us, okay?
All right, thanks, Marty. I'd like to say that I think the breakout sessions really afforded for some great interaction between the SAG members and the staff. And it really resulted in a lot of great ideas on not only who we should do some outreach activities to, but topics that we should do further outreach on. So I think all of the ideas that were given to us in the breakout session and in this larger plenary session will be very helpful for us in going forward. But just to go through the questions at a very high level, the first question on whether the board should conduct outreach, I think yes, there is general support to do some preliminary outreach to define issues, and that can help us to determine the objectives for further outreach and other research and activities, and the format in which to accomplish that additional research, that is, whether to use a SAG task force or roundtables or both. In terms of question 2, the groups to reach out to, there was just a broad range of groups mentioned, and we understand that there's not an agreement on all of those groups, but we heard a lot of good information on who to reach out to and factors to take into account in determining who to reach out to. It's all very helpful. For question 3, whether research is needed, I think there the answer is yes, and there was a lot of thoughts given into areas where additional research could be done. A lot of really good ideas and things for us to take into account. And question 4, what areas of focus should we focus on? Again, as noted in the group summaries, just a broad range of activities and focus. For example, not just narrowly focusing on fraud, but also doing a more holistic view on audit quality as a whole, thinking about where we're getting our information from, better interaction with the SEC and other international organizations and other U.S. organizations that deal with fraud. Just a lot of really good thoughts for us to take this further. And for question 5, on whether the scope of the outreach should also include the audits of broker-dealers, it seems clear that yes, the outreach should cover broker and dealer audits as well. So overall, I think the breakout sessions really gave us some very informative thoughts, really allowed us to engage in very detailed discussion with SAG members, and I think it really puts us in a good position to figure out next steps going forward.
Thanks, Brian. The breakout sessions were very lively. Certainly the one I was in was very lively. I believe the other ones were. I think they were more lively than this past hour has been. I think the presentations from all you guys were great. I think that we probably wore the group out with the discussion on the audit reporting model this morning, and with the strong feelings that many people have around that issue. But I think there also were some strong views expressed yesterday around this area and what we should be doing, and I agree with you, Brian. We got a lot of really good ideas. But we are getting to near the end, and as I begin to maybe make a couple of wrap-up comments, certainly if any of the board members want to join in with any thoughts as we pause, please do so. Jay, first.
Thanks, Marty, and thanks to all of you on our staff for the great job you did in pulling this together. Really a great meeting. I'd like to call on Mike Cook for just a couple minutes of a story that he told me about something he did earlier this week. And the context is I often, when I'm meeting with the firm leaders, ask questions around what are you doing to instill in your youngest professionals all the way to be a baseline all the way through their career about how important their role is in the capital markets and who the real client is. And I've heard some good things from some firms, and I planted a seed with Mike on this recently, and I'd like to have him describe the activity that he did this week with one of the companies that he's on the audit committee of. Mike?
Jay, thank you, and thank you for the idea. And I'll tell you just briefly what it was. But we were together, I think it was at the orientation meeting for SAG, which would have been back in March, at which time Jay was talking with us at lunch about some of the things that might be done to enhance audit quality, and one of the issues being the fact that we have the client, the audit committee, and that's hard for a lot of people to get their minds around because clients for their entire life have been management, and now the world has changed. But the client being the audit committee and how far they are from the people who are working for them in conducting these audits, and particularly as you reach down, we see the partners and we see the top managers, but we rarely see people at the staff levels, and they rarely have any contact outside of the organization. So hard for them to conceive of who the client is when they're so distant from us. So Jay's suggestion was, think about how you might go about having the audit committee or the chairman of the audit committee actually interact with the full audit team for the purpose of stating your expectations, talk to them about risk, talk to them about tone at the top, talk to them about what you expect them to do to help you do your job. And so I think we did have a very successful, in my mind, implementation of this. I'll tell you just very little about it, but and if anybody has any interest in pursuing this at other audit committees and things, just give me a call. I'll be glad to tell you just how we did it. But I think a key point here is the PCAOB, and to our PCAOB colleagues, the board members and the senior staff and the staff people, you see a lot of things. You have lots of opportunities to see best practices and good ideas. And I know that things have been done in recent months and more are underway, but I would urge you, please give us the benefit of your thinking. Give us your good ideas. Give us in any form that you can find, not standard setting per se, but best practices and good ideas for us to react to, because we're all in this together. The old three-legged stool of the auditor and the management and the audit committee has become, in my mind, a four-legged stool, with the regulators being very much a part of that as well. And we all need to find ways to work together, and I have urged that, and I think this is a great illustration of a good idea. The implementation of this was, again, we're a very large company, so the implementation was a little bit of a challenge, and that might sometimes be a reason to say, well, we can't do that. There are too many people involved. But we found ways to do it, combining a live meeting in Philadelphia where we had the 25 top people from the audit team, partners and managers, come and meet with not only the management of the company, but the leaders of internal audit and the audit committee, represented by the chairman, and then by using modern electronic techniques like webcasting and phone calls, teleconferencing, we then reached everybody on the audit team. Now, I didn't take roll, so there might have been a couple of folks who didn't show up, but I'm told that we had everybody on a webcast and teleconference that we did on Tuesday of this week, including people in, obviously more in Philadelphia, New York, Los Angeles, Orlando, London, all the places in the world where we have significant audit operations, and they played the video of the meeting in Philadelphia, so without having to redo it, everybody saw what took place there. And then we spent an hour. I spent an hour with the group in a live teleconference, and had some wonderful reactions and questions, and people identified themselves as they came onto the teleconference, the newest people on the audit. I've been with the firm for 1 year. I've been on this audit for 1 year. I'd like to ask about so-and-so. Very invigorating, I thought, and it wasn't expensive and it didn't take a lot of time. But to the extent we have an audit team of a lot of people in a lot of different locations, particularly younger people, understanding more about how we do these things and the expectations and the important role they play, because my principal message to them was, you are our eyes and ears in the organization. You have to work with management, but you have an accountability to the audit committee, and you need to help us understand not just tone at the top, meaning the CEO and the CFO, but tone within the organization, and you see it every day. And I told him, when I go to a board meeting or an audit committee meeting, it's, like when I used to visit offices in my former life. I mean, all the desks are clean, everything is neat and tidy. Tone at the top is wonderful for at least those 2 days every other month. But what's it like next week or the week after when tough decisions have to be made? How good are the control systems then? How good is the tone at the top and the tone of the organization? So, Jay, I would just say thank you for a good idea. We implemented it. I'd be more than happy to think about ways that we might be able to convey it more broadly. I know my colleague and former partner and good friend Chuck Noski has done this at Microsoft as well, with a very disparate team, geographically disparate team, to try to bring that same end result. But again, to my, I think, most important point, to our PCAOB folks, you see a lot. You can help us, and we're anxious to do a better job, and to the extent that you can find ways to share good things and good ideas with it, at least for me, I will promise you something will get done. So, Jay, thank you.
Thanks, Jay, for that, and thanks, Mike, for summarizing the story. And thanks for your point, Mike. The other point that we are trying to bring out good ideas and put out good releases and trying to help auditors and audit committees do their work. And Jay's advice to you, I'm glad that worked out so well. And it's a two-way street here, as you point out, I think, as well. All of us are in this together. So we got great advice and comments for the past day and a half, but let's not end it there. We're eager to hear from you on a regular basis. Please don't let the next contact be next May when we have another SAG meeting. We're happy to hear telephone calls, email messages, whatever you might have in terms of further thoughts on the topics we discussed over the last 2 days, or any thoughts you have with respect to the activities of standard setting or practice alerts, or the activities of the PCAOB in general. So please be in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. With that, I would like to wrap up and thank everybody for the great participation for the 2 days. Wish everybody safe travels home, and wish everybody a very happy Thanksgiving holiday next week. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.